June 16, 1976 was the spark that ignited the flames of freedom. It represented the power of the youth to catalyze change and their power to have a generational impact, an impact that is today still felt. June 16 was about making sure that the voices of young people are not only heard, but that they reverberate through time and space to shape the future. Today, the voices of young people are rising again and rising even higher.
Young black man, doing all that I can to stand. Oh, but when I look around and I see what's being done to my kind, every day I'm being hunted as prey. My people don't want no trouble.
The barbaric and senseless murder of George Floyd sent an electric shock that ripped through the US. It re-sparked anger, old hurt, outrage, and renewed frustrations regarding the relentlessness of racism, its violence and brutality on Black lives and bodies in the US.
Don't shoot! Don't shoot! Justice! Now! Justice!
The response to the cruelty and the violence of the system has been mass protests, all sending one message: Black Lives Matter. What started as a movement against racism in the US has now spread like wildfire into the rest of the world. As South Africans, we stand in solidarity with the Black Lives Matter movement. However, we also have to confront our own issues and ask ourselves the hard questions. Does the life of Black people matter in the South African context? What is the state of our own race relations in our country? And what flames can the youth of 2020 ignite as we commemorate the contributions of the youth of yesteryear? Dumelang Sambonani. Good evening, South Africa. A very warm welcome to Expressions. This is a very special broadcast as we commemorate June 16, 1976. And I am your host, Jacqueline Maphala. What is important for us in this particular show, Mko, is that as we look at the Black Lives Matter movement, we're asking ourselves as a country, what does this mean in terms of what we're facing as young people in this country?
Absolutely, Jackie. And at the back of that, we have to welcome you to the show. My name is Mxolisi Masango. Now, we are coming to you on this Youth Day at the Hector Peterson Memorial Acre. A place of historical significance, where, Jackie, and we ask the very important question this evening: what should the youth of the country be doing to stem out systematic racism? That's the big question. Do take a look at this insert we have for you.
Racism. Ngoba ngike ngasebenza efemini yabelungu shuthi lapha yamongena siyaxoxa abelungu baxoxa esayidini labo abantu abamnyama baxoxa esayidini labo ngikhuluma ngento yamanje la eRodiport.
The system is still using the same system in apartheid, which is to control people and treat them unfairly like racism does. I mean, what happened with George Floyd, it's nothing new. It's been happening for decades and decades, I understand. So the only way to deal with it, I guess, is to deal with it and speak about it, be open about it.
We experience it at schools, maybe somewhere, like universities, everywhere. Like, it does still exist.
When you get 4 guys in a city golf car, definitely the police will stop those guys. But when you have white guys in a car, the police don't normally stop those guys and search them. According to my experience as a street vendor around here, police will come and search you and do all that, but you find it rare happening to white people around here.
Each person has a responsibility, which is to be fair and treat everyone with respect and equality. No one is superior than the other race. That's what I believe.
Those are very powerful comments from young people from the streets talking about the systematic racism that is facing our country. But to help me unpack this very important issue, I'm joined in my makeshift studio here at the Hector Peterson Memorial Acre by Usfiso Mtsweni from the ANC. I'm also joined by Usunao Tambo from the EFF. And of course, because we are observing social distancing, but also still part of my panel, I'm also joined by Duncan Mthembu, who is from the DA and is also part of our audience. Hello, gentlemen. A very warm welcome to Expressions. Thank you for at least being here with us.
Thank you.
And talking about audience, I want to say hello, hello to your audience. And we also have to commemorate, applaud, and observe and celebrate a 1976 icon, Ntate Bani Mokgatle. And Ntate, a very warm welcome to Expressions. Thank you for being here. Ngo?
Well, Jackie, we are on standby as the audience. Guys, thank you so much for joining us, and thank you as well for braving the cold weather to have this very important discussion with us on Expressions. You two there at home, we invite you to partake in this important discussion on all our social media platforms. Jackie, let's get the conversation going.
Indeed, let's get this conversation started. I think, Sfiso, let me start with you. We know that the ANC has at least kick-started a very important campaign around anti-racism as part of their solidarity with the Black Lives Matter movement. But specifically for South Africa and for South African youth, what does this campaign mean?
Well, thank you very much, Jackie, for having us. And yes, indeed, today we stand, I would say, at the shoulders of giants. Would remember that 1976, young people in this country, students in particular, stood up against a racist system that sought to impose itself through education, through the imposition of Bantu education. And of course, 42 years later, we're here. The whole world is facing a very bleak environment. We are in the middle of a very deadly pandemic, which has seen the whole world being locked down. But at the same time, we've seen horrific scenes of racism, structural racism. We've seen it in the US, we've seen it in the UK. Quite horrifically, we've seen a march of people actually coming out to say we are racist, we are proud racists. And in our country, we can see daily people expressing themselves in various platforms, actually continuously displaying very bad racist attitudes. And I think the moment has come for us as we stand here today, as we sit here and commemorate these heroes, to say enough is enough. Racism has to stop. Our society cannot tolerate any more racism.
And so now, as we're talking about just the culture of systematic racism in South Africa, I want to find out from you the simple question of, do Black lives matter in South Africa?
I would certainly say they don't in South Africa. In fact, it is quite ironic because one must question with what moral authority do those in power in South Africa, and perhaps South Africans themselves, seek to speak on behalf of or defend Black lives. Was it between the Marikana massacre or the brutalization of fees must fall students who were demanding free education that we realized that Black lives matter in this country? Was it between the moments when we were burning foreign nationals from the African continent, kicking them out and labeling them as criminals, that we started to realize that Black lives matter? So there's no moral authority that South Africans or those in power who attempt to run campaigns today can run to say that they are in defense of Black lives, because currently in South Africa, Black life does not matter, because Black life and racism, of course, is not an expression of slurs or insults, but rather a systemic system that those in political power have the ability to change by changing the economic disparities in this country, by altering the spatial racism that characterizes how our society is structured. So Black lives don't matter in this country at a structural level, and those in political power have failed to alter that reality.
And Duncan, I want to bring you into this conversation. As we commemorate June 16, 1976, young people who themselves were protesting, right, against a very brutal system. I want to find out from you, what about this moment is different for us as young people, as 2020 youth? Is this moment different? Actually, maybe that's the right question to ask.
Well, I think that when we speak about racism, it's something that has always been in our spaces. And there's nothing different when you compare the previous era and now. What we need to do is to rather act more harsher to those who are racist. Because, listen, a racist is not written on the forehead to say that, hey, I'm racist. But you see by whatever that they do or how they treat the people that they are around. And in most cases, you'd find that our parents, because they got subjected to a certain lifestyle, and it's difficult for them now to acknowledge and to accept or to even realize that things have changed. But us as the young people in this country, it's our responsibility to be conscious and actually educate those who are around us, and to make sure that when we see an act of racism or gender-based violence, we deal with it harshly. So we make sure that we report those, and those must be dealt with by getting harsher sentences. And the system, our system must come into effect and actually do more and do better.
Sfiso, I mean, again, looking back, 1976, we're in 2020. Why are we still having the same conversations around racism? Why hasn't anything changed in such a long time?
Well, I wouldn't say nothing changed. I think there are sporadic incidences, some of them quite unfortunate, as my colleague says here. We've seen the brutalization of black lives in this country, and that's a bad thing. But at the same time, we've seen a massive rollout of education in this country, which is no longer subjected to Bantu education. We've seen thousands and thousands of young black graduates in our country. We've seen thousands and thousands of young black people's lives actually improving for the better, notwithstanding the fact that there's a lot of lives that are still subjected to poverty. And one of the other things I agree with is that racism derives itself from the economic disparities that we find in our country. Those who continue to sit at the top of the economic table remain those who were there before 1994. The pace of transformation has not been as fast as it should have been, but I think the moment has come now for us to really reflect. We've had 25 years of our democracy. The next 25 years, we need to get rid of the euphoria of 1994. We need to face this particular question properly. And I think all of us agree the time has come for us to fundamentally change the economic structure of our country in the interest of the majority.
And so now maybe you can sort of maybe clarify this. What is it about this moment, this time, this place we find ourselves as young people that is different from any other moment that young people before us have sort of found themselves in? What would be the difference?
There isn't much in terms of the realities that we're confronted with. So in the same way, I'd like to disagree with my colleague. Like the South African education system is characterized by racial disparity and economic disparity. We see it. It's been made sharper by this COVID-19 pandemic. Over 1,500 schools in the townships have been vandalized and currently can't return to normality. Majority of schools in rural areas don't have toilets. They use pit toilets, so they're not hygienic enough to accommodate the students, whereas you've compared them to those schools in the suburbs. That's a revelation of a system that was present in 1976. Black students were complaining about the lack of infrastructure development of black schools. So our realities from apartheid to now have not changed at a substantial level. We've managed to sneak in a few black people into corporate sectors through the BEE system. We've managed to sneak in a few black people into institutions of higher learning. But the basic reality is the fact that there are more people getting excluded from institutions of higher learning than they are graduating. There are more students committing suicide than they are graduating. There are more people in the townships living in squalor than there are those who have sort of lived an affluent life or have moved up in terms of the standard of living. So our realities have not changed. They've changed for the few. And that's not what we should be striving for.
Indeed. And think I mean, as we continue to ask this very important question around what is the role of young people in South Africa in terms of changing the systematic racism that is present in South Africa, I think it's a very important question that hopefully you're asking yourself. And obviously our guests have given us a lot of food for thought, and we continue this very important conversation after the break. And Mxolisi is going to be coming to us from the audience. Make sure you stay with us. We'll be back right after this.
Now, we are coming to you from the Hector Peterson Memorial. Welcome back. You're still with Expressions, and this is your #1 Youth Current Affairs show. Now, this evening, we're having a very important conversation around what the youth of the country should be doing to outroot systematic racism. Guys, thank you so much for joining us. Before we continue with this conversation, or before we get started, Bapani, I need to bring you into this conversation. I heard somewhere in our panelists as well, there was a worry about why are we still having conversations about racism at this time in our democracy? What's your take on that?
Thank you very much, Baba. You know, in the beginning, they said God created man in his own image. And I think the problem, like Usti Bigo Shuguti, the mindset is the most important thing. We can do whatever we want to do, but unless you change your mindset, then you are not going to change. So as long as people don't understand that other human beings are human beings and they are the same with them, we'll never get anywhere. And at the same time, unless the government take a tough stance to say they must criminalize racism, because racism all over the world is the same. Whether in America, whether in South Africa, it's the same. It kills. It kills spiritually, it kills mentally. So what we should do, because as the youth of today, we're saying to them, in all the world, the youth are the one who come with the change. So we're telling the youth and giving a mandate to them that they must be the one who are changing the mindset of the people. They must go into discussions. They must talk about it. They must know themselves who they are. Because if you don't know yourself, your mindset will never change. Because the roots are important. So we are saying today, this evening, that racism will stay unless our mindset changes. Thank you very much.
You're making a very important point here. You know, you just said that we are all the same. Bringing in, another element into this. The African diaspora joins us this evening. Can I get some guys from the African diaspora, please, to partake in the conversation? You guys, the concern you had around xenophobia in the country, can you speak to us about that?
Xenophobia, like we all know, is when people have been discriminated for being possible foreigners. And me as a Nigerian, I have, with time, observed different discrimination against me as a person and other folks that I know as foreigners who live in South Africa. And this has actually, it has various level of effect on our daily life. It affects us psychologically, and it brings our self-esteem down to almost zero because you don't know what's going to happen to you the next day. You could be setting up a business, because I'm an entrepreneur. I run my own business, but every day I'm worried about what's going to happen to my business in the next 3 years. And imagine that on a larger scale, where we live as if we live on a temporary basis, but you're not supposed to be living your life on that level. You're supposed to be sure and be firm to know that when you establish yourself here, you're going to be here to see the rewards of your establishment. So the risk to you as a foreigner is very high, and that goes further from me as a person who suffer it directly, and to the people who I employ become victims as well, whether they are South Africans or not, because there's no business that can exist within a tribal setup. So as a business, I employ other people who works for me. I don't discriminate whether they're South Africa or they're Nigeria or they're Zimbabwe. But now when these factors come and hit my business, everybody become a victim.
Okay, maybe we can also, I'd like to bring you into this conversation as well. We as Expressions have engaged with you on numerous, occasions on different topics. Oputi is bringing a very important element to this, how we're seeing black on black violence a lot. Perhaps maybe just also touching on that. Are we far from winning the fight against racism in the country?
Look, the sad thing is that we've had this conversation, and we are back at it again. And there is nothing new. And the death of a fellow brother in America there was nothing new about it. It has been happening. It's just that this time people decided to act. It's the same thing the youth of 1976 did. There was perpetual victimization, and they decided to act. And this youth was very courageous in a sense that when they were shot, they took stones and retaliated. But what you see today is that there is a lot of things that are happening in terms of people are relying too much on political parties, and they are not going to bring any change. People must act for themselves. Systematic racism, you're not going to see it with your eyes. What happens is that black people need their dignity. They need the land. You give them land, black people have dignity. And the more our people have dignity, they see themselves better. Today, as a black man, if you want to buy a bond house, the way you are treated is going to be different with your fellow friend who's white, irregardless of whether that white person is being racist or what. But the system, the policies that are implemented are racial in themselves. And political parties are doing nothing. Yes, government, ANC government has been there, but literally they are doing nothing. They are eating with these people. They are eating at the hands. They are feeding at the hands of these white people who are funding political parties. It's the same with your EFF. It's the same with DA. DA is worse. I don't even want to touch on it.
All right. Okay, we'll come back and get some responses on that as well. My sister, you bring an interesting take around institutional racism. You're still in school, right? Talk to us about that.
For me, let me talk from personal experience. So I'm originally from Pretoria. So you would get a white teacher telling you when you're making noise, this is not Marava start, or go do that in Mamelodi. You know, when that was done to me, I didn't see it as racism. Now that I think back, it was mentally degrading me. You're saying that I belong in a township. So in a way, they were saying that I don't belong in that school because of how I act, how I laugh. I remember some teacher once told me that I'm too loud to be smart. I still don't get it. How can you tell me my voice shouldn't be like this and then compare it to my marks? So there's always comparisons. You have science fairs, you come with this big project, but you never win because you're black. You make speeches, you never win. People were clapping for you, but somebody, because their skin is lighter, they always win. So it's those things that bring us down. And I think if you're not strong enough, that could actually make you feel worthless as a black child, that I cannot achieve anything because people feel like you cannot stand, or you can't be smart, you can't be this. You're always talked down in classrooms and everywhere that you go. So that is something I've experienced myself, and some people actually take it personally, and it manifests in their lives.
Yeah. Oliver, the sense is that politicians aren't really doing enough to stem out racism in our society. What's your take on that?
Somehow we were disillusioned into believing we can negotiate racism away. That's never going to happen. Racism isn't something you can talk away, wish away, because the people who are expressing the racism, the racist people, are not ignorant in the sense of they know exactly what they're doing, right? They know exactly that they have the power to do what they're doing. And unless you strip away the source of their power, you're never going to be able to get racism to go away. More than that, though, we can talk about racism, we can talk about sexism, we can talk about misogyny and all of that. But if there's an unwillingness on the part of the people who are racist to change, there's absolutely nothing you can do about it. You can throw Penny Sparrow in jail as many times as you want, but if Penny Sparrow's family are unwilling to change, we're going to have this conversation forever. So the big question really is, if racism can't be negotiated away, how then do we get it to go away? And the reality is that those who are racist must either be removed from society altogether, or the source of their power that empowers them to be racist must be stripped away from them unapologetically.
All right, some strong sentiments there from young people. And we, of course, invite you at home to be part of this discussion on all of our social media platforms. We're on Facebook as expressions_10. This all-important discussion returns when we come back. Stay with us.
Welcome back. You're watching Expressions, and this is our June 16 special broadcast. And tonight we are obviously celebrating and commemorating the spirit of young people to catalyze change. And of course, the at least poll question that we're asking you on our show is, what is the role of the youth of South Africa in changing systematic racism in our country? Now, we have changed things up a little bit, and we have new panelists for our show, just so we can continue this conversation. I'm joined by editor and author of the book called Roads Must Fall, The Struggle to Decolonize the Racist Heart of Empire, Uati Nangamso Mkobo. Did I get that right? Yes, I love that. I love that. And then I'm also joined as well by political analyst Jamie Mighty. Hello, Jamie. I'm also joined by political commentator Oliver Dixon. We heard from him just before the break. And I'm also joined as well in our audience by Ucebo Kumalo from SESCO. Hello, can you hear me? Hello, guys. Okay, so we continue this very important conversation. And there were some very important, I think, comments that came from our studio audience when we were talking about, this issue around racism. And some of the points that I just want us to sort of touch on is this issue around, how exactly do we strip power from those who are racist? I don't know who wants to take it. Ati, do you want to maybe answer that question?
Yes. I think the Black Lives Matter movement in the United States provides us a moment to not only learn from the Black tradition of protest, action, and defiance, but to take the question further, the way that the June 16 generation took the question further against resistance and a lack of imagination, quite frankly, within our society. And the specific thing I'm referring to here is the argument for abolition. An opportunity for us to imagine that the institutions we had always relied on to protect and serve, the institutions we always thought were going to educate us, are in fact themselves fundamentally and foundationally racist. So it's no longer a question of, do we reform the University of Pretoria? Do we decolonize the University of Cape Town? Or do we fund the police more or defund the police in order to make sure that they don't use our tax and resources to kill, abuse, and devalue the lives of Black people? I think we now need to start having a conversation, as is our tradition as young people to do, that kickstarts us into imagining another society where we don't have the police, because the police are foundationally a racist institution whose heart is to police Blackness and the slave non-community of people, and protect white society and white community from their fears, of the Swat Khafar, or the emergence of Black power and Black dignity. We need to start imagining that the university isn't a place we can reform and take away statues in order to have more access for Black people, but that in fact that university was central to creating in our society's consciousness, to engineering a white supremacist and particularly anti-Black society that is always and already going to devalue, kill, maim Black people, whether there is a Black VC, whether that Black VC is a woman. Those institutions are just designed that way. Their DNA is designed for Black subjugation and the devaluation of Black life.
Jamie, for a lot of people, not only in the country, but all across the world, who look at South Africa and they're saying, well, I mean, is there really an issue around racism in this country? I mean, your government is Black. Everything in this country is Black. So, I mean, South Africa is past this. We've managed to find a way to overcome it because politically, the people who represent us are Black. I mean, what would you like to say to people who feel that there's no racism because, Black people are in charge, Black people have political power? I mean, our president is Black.
Well, the president may be Black, and so Mrs. Lambo may be too, but that doesn't necessarily mean that we've attained the gains that we sought. So going back a little bit to the first question about what ought we to do to change the system. Number one, we need to redirect rands from racist institutions. The thing is, we spend more money, and here I'm talking to the Black middle class. We spend more money on bottles and fancy clothes than we do really creating the society we deserve. No community around the world will respect us unless we get our ish together, if I may say that. But going further than that, the reality is this battle that was fought in 76 was paused because Bantu education still exists today. How else do you explain it to me that 80% of grade 4s cannot read for meaning when we spend hundreds of millions of dollars a year on educating the Black child? So if young people want to know what they need to do, they need to look at the ministers responsible for education and say, we are going to shut this down until we get the education we deserve. That means paying the teachers better than you do now, firing the bad ones, and making sure that schools have whiteboards, they have libraries, they have internet connectivity, and that's how we begin to see a real transformation in our society. Many people, when they are asked about Africa, will say, I don't understand why they don't have their stuff together. And we really don't. Now, if you're looking at the home base, everybody, when they make jokes about Africa, it's always around poverty, around starvation, around flies on our eyes and mouths, right? So you can have a black president. In fact, you can have 55 of them, right? But if there hasn't been real reform in those spaces, you're not necessarily going to have a place where people can look and say, I'm from Africa with pride. When people from China say they're from China, they have a certain pride about that because of the positionality of China right now. People in South Korea, when they say they're from South Korea, they have a certain pride around saying that. But now if you are trying to say you're from Uganda, you're from this country or that country, if you are in America, they don't actually rate that because we haven't done a good job in Africa of making the home base for all black people around the world, be they Jamaican, be they in Jamaica, Queens, in New York. We need to make sure that we get our stuff together here, we redirect our rands, and have an honest conversation about the institutions in this society.
And I want to bring Uclevo into this conversation. I think whenever we talk about racism, I mean, nobody can forget that image of George Floyd on the floor and, the police being so brutal towards him with the knee on his neck. I want to find out from you, as someone who's representing the student body in this country, what does that look like when we talk about the knee on the neck of black people, at least black students in our country? What does that look like in terms of the students in this country?
Thank you. Racism is very broad. And the battle that Black Lives Matter is trying to fight, or is attempting to fight, is very broad. In South Africa, I know that ideally racism is in between people of different skin. But racism is the failure of government to protect women. That's racism. The failure of government to build schools, university of vendor, to maintain it. It accommodates majority of black people. That's racism. The failure of government to redirect resources, mineral resources, so that they can benefit our mothers and fathers, is racism. The disrespect that the government is showing to this youth that sacrificed their lives and fought, and still today you do not have free education, that is racism. And I'm telling you, we're being oppressed by the same government that claims to fight for us. We're being oppressed by the very same people who stood with some of these souls who are lying here.
Yeah.
And they claim that they fight for us. The only way to change this system, and Fees Must Fall attempted something like that, even though the same government that claims to have fought for this freedom incarcerated a lot of people, and a lot of students are still suffering. We must retaliate. But before you retaliate, conscientize the mind. Racism is what is going to happen after coronavirus. A lot of black students who do not have access to your Wi-Fi, to your laptops, are going to be excluded, not because they can't read, but because they stay in areas where they do not have resources.
Yeah.
Right now, they are saying coronavirus cases are very high in primary schools, and they're saying students must stay at home.
Yeah. So
Private schools are going to attend.
Yeah.
Public schools are probably going to be encouraged to stay at home.
Yeah.
That's racism against our people.
So we definitely, Oliver, and I want to bring you into this into this conversation as we wrap this particular segment up. I mean, obviously, racism, flares up in different forms. It's economic, it's social, it's cultural, it's institutional, it's systematic. I think what I want to find out from you is, as much as Tabo was talking about government is failing us, government this, government that, in terms of just the role of young people, everyday young people, grassroots young people, what can we do practically to change things?
Look, that was right. Government is not going to rescue us. I have to give you all the, building blocks to understand why that's the case. Because these institutions, including our political parties, their DNA is based on racism. You're not going to. We're trying to sanitize institutions that can't be. It's not in their nature to not be racist. They are funded by racists. They are conceptualized by racists. They are infiltrated by racists. And it's not just racist as an individual, but systemic and systematic, right? So it's endemic. You can't extract it out of it. So what then can we do? Jamie gave you the answer for that. Jamie says we need to redirect where we spend our money. You can't be anti-racism and tomorrow you're buying from ShopRite. You can't be anti-racism. And I think the BDS movement is very clear on this, right? And they borrow that attitude from the movement Ati spoke about, which is a resistance movement we've seen successful in America before. If you compare what BDS is doing versus borrowing that attitude from the Montgomery bus boycott, if you disempower the system that is built on racism, if you disempower its source of it, right, you're breaking down the structure of that racism, and so it's in simple things, it's in everyday things of making sure you don't spend on racist institutions and further empower and embolden them, and making sure that you stand up to racism even when it's deeply uncomfortable to do so, not just when it's cool on Twitter, but also in institutions that we belong to. Call them out. And call out the source of that racism, call it by its name, and not try to build a beautiful flower color around it.
Yeah. Shucks, I think there's definitely more to sort of unpack with that, and obviously we're going to allow you guys to be part of the audience, and then you can continue this conversation. So, but clearly I think what we're basically understanding from this is that your money actually counts. So where you decide to spend your money has a lot to do with what kind of transformation you can bring to the space that you are a part of. I mean, we want you obviously to continue having these conversations within your personal spaces as well, and with your friends and your family members, to find out really what does racism mean for you, and how can we change it as young people. You're still watching Expressions. We are back right after this.
So welcome back to the special edition show of Expressions on SABC News. Now, this evening we're speaking to young people. We really want to find out what can they be doing to stem out racism in our society. Guys, thank you so much. Still in this very cold weather, still observing lockdown regulations. There was something Usisi said when she was still in the panel. She spoke about how police are brutalizing the very same people they're supposed to be protecting. You were at the receiving end of this. Speak to us about that.
I mean, when it comes to police brutality, when you are attempting to fight against a racist system or an oppressive system in South Africa, around the world, they don't take into cognizance the nature of the people that they are dealing with, right? A lot of the times the police that we have, or the private security that we're meted against, are ex-militia people. These are people who are trained in warfare, who are trained to kill, who aren't trained in crowd control, for an example. So when I was arrested on the countless amount of times that I was faced with, a lot of brutality, be it from, being extracted from the crowd of the Fees Must Fall movement into the van and being put into a private cell myself. That type of interrogation was very violent. When it was violent psychologically, it was violent very emotionally, mentally as well. And violence is the language of the police. They don't know how to engage with society or with citizens. They don't know how to protect. How they do know how to engage with people is from a violent perspective, and that is something that has been taught from generations, right? Racism also, to a large extent, is stemmed and is rooted in violence. So for our police and our security systems to be very violent, it also comes back from the fact that they were taught to be this way. So at this present point in time, there's no way for us to uncondition the security systems of the police in this country. But what we need to do is we need to now engage in black pride. And by engaging in black pride, we need to now say racism is something that is not going to go away in the the next 20, 30, 100 years. It's a dream for us to assume that it will. But what we now need to do is to counter racism. We need to come up with black pride, and this is where black consciousness comes into the forefront.
Now, but Bunny, I see you also nodding there frantically. I know there was also another point you wanted to wallpaper for us on this conversation about police specifically.
Police brutality is police brutality. Be it inflicted by white police racists, be it inflicted by black police who we say they are free, it's still brutality. Now, we expect them to be helping us. During 1976, we were shot by white police, supported by black people. But now, it's black people who are shooting at us and killing at us. And the same bullet which killed us that time is the same bullet which is shooting us now. So we expect the policemen to change. But at the same time, as my daughter there said, that the police have been trained to know how to handle situations. You don't just shoot and ask questions later. You must assess the situation because you are trained. And ordinary people, we must teach them how to respond to situations. They must respect the uniform. That the uniform of police, the uniform of soldier is the emblem of our country. But at the same time, the same breath, the president is at the head. He must instruct down that, look, this is what you support. These are your people. These are your brothers. These are your sisters. Don't kill them.
Yeah. Okay, let's bring you in, Budwama. I think you also had another point to add on to this conversation. Yeah.
No, thanks very much, Mko. I think it is very important and paramount for us to say that in most cases when we deal with police, we find that police are afraid to deal with serious issues such as rape, serious crimes of murder. But if you find learners marching in the street, you'll find police, majority of them, intimidating learners. So ours as young people of this country, we are saying that we are not going to be busy saying that the police are or brushing feelings of the police. But ours is very simple, that in terms of making sure that we move forward and run away from this thing of racism, first we must deal with the statues of the post-apartheid that are still existing. You'll find the statue of a white man who was in those apartheid times in this particular democracy that we are in. So it can be correct that we'll be dealing with issues of democracy, yet there are still some other things that are still representing the particular racist thing that happened in the past.
Siswami, you also had something to add as we continue with this conversation, yeah?
Yes, not from a political view, of course, but from a student's view. Obviously, I know that many people around, they understand racism. Yes, racism is not something that we've been taught at school. Racism is not something that we hear about every day. As they say, it's not something that is tangible or something that we see every day. But racism is something that happens, and that happens between one people or many people, as this brother said right here. As a student, I know that racism does exist, because at my school we don't have resources that at a private school has. I can't have the same tablet. I can't have the same whiteboard as the private school has. As everybody has said, that racism does happen and it's real. So we must teach learners and teach the younger generation that racism does happen, so that we can end it. Thank you. All right.
More comments from the audience. Putwami here, Put Duncan, yes.
I think that it's important when we are discussing such serious issues that are affecting our people. We should make it clear that South Africa belongs to all who live in it. And as young people, we should be mindful of saying that when we say that Black lives matter, we are not saying that Indians' lives does not matter. We are not saying that white people's lives does not matter. We are not saying that any other race lives does not matter. And we should always be careful that when we debate such issues, we are basing our argument on the issue of an individual character more than generalizing. Because the problem that we have in this country is an issue of access. people do not have access to education. People do not have access to jobs. People do not have access to the protection that the police must give to us. As much as the majority of the people who are affected is black people, but we should never, when we discuss such things, and say that every white person is racist or every Indian is racist. But we need to take cases as per the merits that are facing us.
All right. But let's speak to some solutions, perhaps. You've heard the generation of today speak.
Yeah, the generations of today, what I might advise them, or what I want to advise them with, is that they belong to different political parties. But when they come to student issues, let there be a movement, let there be one. Because we in 76, we did not fight as political parties. We fought as a movement. And only as a movement will go forward. Because the system can destroy you as an organization. But as a movement, they can't destroy you. Because now the movement includes everybody, whether you are an adult, whether you're a student. But the student, the youth, must take a baton forward. Because we have given them a baton. So they are the one we are relying on. They are the ones which we said, they must keep it to the next generation, and the next generation to the next generation. Otherwise, if they don't do it, it's going to stop now. So we say racism is racism, and it must stop now, unless we take an attitude to say racism is wrong. Then we're not going to get anywhere. Because remember that racism is intertwined with capitalism. So until we also destroy capitalism, racism will still remain, because capitalism thrives on the blood and sucking the blood of the workers. So we must be conscious. As Steve Biko, Black Consciousness, said, know who you are, be conscious, you can be aware. But until you are conscious, you're not going to get anywhere.
But there's a question that keeps ringing in my head when we have this conversation and as we reflect. Was it all worth it?
I think it was worth it. When we fought that day, we did not know that tomorrow will be called icons. We're fighting for a genuine cause. So we are saying even the students of today, because we fought for them, people died for them. The blood at Vilagazi Street, which was spilled, it was for them to be free. And they must make sure that they must focus on their studies. It's worth it. And if it's worth it, they must make sure that even for the students and the youth tomorrow, they must make it worth it. We help them. Because if we did not fight at that time, they will be still learning under Africans. They will be still segregated. And we say the institution must know that they are a mirror of a country. Unless this institution change, and the white people, when black people go to their schools and they run away, you can see that systematic racism is still there. Because why are they running away from black people? Even the teachers, why do they insult? I mean, the young lady was there. I mean, that's insultive to call a black child in that manner. She's a human being. We are all human beings. So we must make sure that even the Department of Education gets involved. And also we are saying even the rural areas, because people tend to neglect the rural areas. Those are important things. And last point, we have taken upon ourselves that we must try and teach the children from the early stage so that we can get their strength. There's no point just generalizing, say, you are going to be a lawyer, you're going to be... Let them have strength. Then at least you will never have a failure in life. But if you say, learn maths, and the child doesn't know maths, but if you find a strength that this child is good in handwork, using hands, then at least we'll have a better economy tomorrow.
Thank you very much for that, Baba. Yeah. And of course, we continue with this all-important discussion when we come back from the break. In this time of COVID and in this time of this very important month for the youth of the country, we continue when we come back. This is Expressions.
Welcome back. You're still watching Expressions, and we, of course, are commemorating Youth Day here on the show and obviously celebrating the spirit of young people to catalyze needed change in our community. And the question that we're asking you is, what is the role of young people in South Africa in changing systematic racism in our country? And of course, we've heard a lot from young people, not only from our panel, but also from our audience. But now, as we wrap up the show, we want to find out, what is the way forward? How do we make sure that we bring sustainable change when it comes to racism? I'm joined by my panelists. I'm joined from the Institute of Race Relations. I'm joined by Gabriel Krauser, as well as from the Nelson Mandela Foundation. I'm joined by Neo Mogopa. Welcome to Expressions. It's good to have you.
Thank you, Jackie.
I'm sure, I mean, you've sat through the whole entire show. You've been listening to some of the comments that were coming from young people, you know, around what needs to be done, what young people can do to bring about change. I think maybe let me maybe direct this question to you, coming from the Nelson Mandela Foundation, and we know how you have stood up against racism, how you've acted against it. What is your advice to young people around what they can do to really bring about sustainable change when it comes to systematic racism in our country?
Thank you, Jackie. I thought thank you very much for having us on this panel. I thought I would love to touch on the question on abolishing the police and defunding the police as well in this conversation as we try to find solutions. I think it's an interesting conversation that has been around for a long time now, at least until 1935. And the real impetus of the question around defunding the police has really been about funding means and methods for self-actualization. And the call to defund the police has always been a call to direct funds to entertainment, direct funds to mental health, to direct funds to social care, you know? And there's never been a call that was simply anti, but had a very strong, positive, pro approach on top of that as well.
Mm-hmm. And for you, Gabriel, you know, looking back, 1976, and representing the Institute of Race Relations, have we made progress as a country in terms of our race relationships in this country?
Certainly we have. In many ways this country's failed, but in many ways it's succeeded. Our polling consistently shows that attitudes of ordinary people who don't have microphones like I do feel that race relations have strongly improved on all sides of the racial divides. I do think that this conversation has been really interesting, though, in showing sort of one of the disconnects that we have here, which is a new sense of what racism is. Racism is all parties, we've just heard. Racism is all policing, we've just heard. Racism is all sort of wealth inequality, or all corruption, or all lack to good service delivery. And that idea of racism, I think, sort of debunks or debases the original concept and creates a potential for a major problem, which I think is something that we pick up at the Institute of Race Relations a lot in our polling, in our conversations with ordinary South Africans, which is a failure of accountability. So one name I haven't heard is Collins Khoza. One name I haven't heard is Petrus Michels. One name I haven't heard is Sibusiso Amos. These people were killed by the police, not to protect whiteness, not under white supremacy, as the Nelson Mandela Foundation has said, and as we heard earlier this evening, but to enforce the lockdown regulations that prevented all South Africans from being able to purchase alcohol, and even then in an illegal and an irrational and a completely unconstitutional way. We need to hold the leaders accountable who have said, shoot to kill. We need to hold the leaders accountable who have said, if you don't have an arrest warrant, just slap people around. These are leaders of our country still today, but we are not holding them accountable. Why? Because we label everything that goes wrong as racism. Of course there's racism in this country, but not everything that goes wrong is racism. When we label everything that goes wrong as racism, those in power are able to deflect accountability from themselves. This is the story of state capture that started in a way in 2003 when Bulelani Nguka was labeled impimpi, to stop the prosecution of the sheikhs, to stop the prosecution of the Zumas. And ever since then, a kind of racialization has been used to slur black people, white people, Indian people, colored people, when they look for accountability in order to protect the powerful. And those who suffer are the weakest and the most vulnerable. So I think to go forward, we need to be clear about different issues. Corruption is one issue. Abuse of power is one issue. Police brutality is one issue. A poor education system is one issue. Not everything is race. That is also an issue. And to take it seriously, we must also consider it in its place relative to the other places of problems in this country.
Gabriel says not everything is racism. So I think as we wrap up our panel conversation and discussion on this important issue around racism, I want to say a big thank you to all my guests who've come through and given us a lot of food for thought. And I'm going to throw everything to you just to close us off in terms of this conversation.
Guys, we're wrapping the conversation up now. My brother, the way moving forward as young people, what needs to happen?
It is the personal responsibility for the person as an individual to change
the dynamics and the functions of his life or her life. I do understand that there are times where we will find conflict, and that is just the way of the universe, and that is just natural law. But because there are adverse forces, I do not think we should demarcate our system and say, no, I'm not where I should be because this person holds the power to liberate me, to put me in a certain position. I think it is time right now for us as people, as a united Africa, to understand we have a greater responsibility to ourselves and to the next generation to stop pointing fingers and start actually getting to work.
We have to thank you so much for braving the cold weather this evening to come here and have this very important conversation. And of course, Jackie, as Expressions, we've just started it as an agent of transformation, and we've given voice to these very important voices this evening. Once again, a very big thanks for you for joining us there at home on the special broadcast on DSTV channel 404. That's the SABC News platform. We thank you so much for your participation on all of our social media platforms. Well, Jackie, we've got a performance that's closing us off this evening. And of course, from all of us here at Expressions, we wish you a spectacular evening going forward. And of course, a big thanks to the Hector Peterson Memorial for hosting us this evening.